I have Dr. Peter Scire with me here again today on Facebook to talk all about working memory and the role of the cerebellum in working memory. But before we get going, I want to just, for those of you so first of all, welcome, Dr. Scire. Thanks for joining me again. I really appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
But before we get started, just in case you're not familiar with Dr. Scire and his work, Dr. Peter Scire has dedicated his academic and clinical career over the past 15 years to work with complex neurological disorders in both adults and children. And he has received his doctorate in chiropractic from Life University, as well as extensive postdoctoral training in functional neurology with concentrations in childhood developmental disorders, vestibular rehabilitation, and brain injury rehabilitation. In addition to his functional neurology training, Dr. Scire has amassed thousands of hours of continued education in areas of functional immunology, functional endocrinology, and advanced concepts in neurochemistry and nutrition over the past decade. Since 2004, Dr. Scire has collaborated with Dr. Robert Melillo, the founder of the Brain Balance Centers and Hemispheric Integration Therapy. And after a decade working with children, Dr. Scire established the Scire Integrative Health Center in Atlanta, which specializes in complex neurological and metabolic disorders, utilizing the latest advancements in neurological rehabilitation and diagnostic testing. He's a founding member of the International Association of Functional Neurology and Rehabilitation, otherwise known as IAFNR. And he's served as president of IAFNR from 2015 to 2016. And when away from practice, Dr. Scire is a dad to his son, Nicholas, who is 18, and his 13-year-old daughter, Emma. So thanks again for being here with us. And I think everybody can agree that this is really wonderful of you to share your time with us and all the parents that watch us here at My Child Will Thrive. So thanks again.
It's great being back. So let's have some fun today.
Yeah. And we've had some questions that have come in ahead of time, but I think what we want to do is first touch base on you. We've been doing this a few times already. So I want to touch base on the things we've quickly recap what you've talked about in the past, so that people who haven't had a chance to watch one of these before, they are can review back to those videos. They're still posted here on the Facebook page. You can take a look at them and listen to them later. So can you quickly recap, because we're trying to sort of build the information and knowledge so people can start to understand how the brain develops in these kids and where things may go offline at some point in time. So do you mind just recapping the conversations really quickly that we've had the past couple times?
Yeah, I mean, what we basically been doing is just taking our parents and our viewers through the developmental neurology of the human brain. Because at the end of the day, when we're looking at these different developmental disorders, ultimately what they are is a reflection of how the brain is maturing and going through its maturation in different pathways. And that the current thinking in neurology, and this is going back, now 30, 40 years, but more recently, probably in the last 20 years in terms of neuroimaging, they're very defined pathways, neural networks that have had alterations in structural aspects at an anatomical level, which then leads to functional aspects. Okay, so we're always talking about structure and function, that we know that there are specific genetic relationships that are playing a role in the way the structure of the brain is actually developing. We know that there are specific epigenetic influences that are also altering the structure of the human brain, which then ultimately alters the what we call functional connectivity. Functional connectivity is just a real complex word to say, hey, these connections that exist between different structures in the human brain. And the one thing that makes the human brain so unique is that the human brain is so lateralized and so specialized in its functionality. So when we're looking at the symptoms in a child or an adult, ultimately what we're looking at is how are these different areas of the brain actually functioning? So the conversation that you and I have been having is we've been starting through the different parts of what we call the neuroaxis, and we spent a little bit of our time in the brainstem and really talking about the lower parts of the brain and what their contribution is to to early development. And the brainstem is the major part of the brain that is actually working within those first 12, 13 months of life. So we touched about the presence of primitive reflexes, okay? Or first saying that, yes, primitive reflexes are there. They should be there in utero. They should be there within the first 0 to 3 months, and they move on to other more specific primitive reflexes throughout the first 12 months of life. But around no later than about 14 months of life, these primitive reflexes actually should be shut off. That there are certain higher structures in the brain that have begun to form and then begin to develop inhibition to certain circuits in the brainstem. However, when those primitive reflexes are still retained, they are a sign that there is immaturity in the brain. And then we started briefly talking about the different parts of the brainstem and talking about that there are 3 major parts of the brainstem. There's the medulla, there is the pons, and then there is the midbrain, or what we call the mesencephalon. And within those areas, there's specific cranial nerves that are housed in those parts of the brain. And that this is why it's very important to do a very comprehensive cranial nerve exam on a child or an adult to look at, again, windows into the brain. And what's great about the human brain is it's very much like just the circuits that are in your house, that there's a certain circuit that goes in the back of the wall, goes up to your ceiling fan in your bedroom and stuff like that. And so we get to look at this circuit and we get to see this circuit in real time. We don't necessarily have to rely on mirror imaging or any specific brain data to do that. We can just look at a very bedside exam to look at the function of, say, the eyes. There's 3 major cranial nerves that move the eyes. So when we actually start doing specific eye movements, we can actually assess the integrity of those eye movements. And we know that those particular cranial nerves live in a certain part of the brain stem. So when those parts of the eye movements may not be working as well, we can look at how the brainstem is working in relationship to different parts of the upper part of the brain. So at the end of the day, we're just talking about all these very specific circuits, and I'm trying to make it very easy to understand the process of that. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's what's been great about having these conversations is that we can see, especially in our kids, parents can see and understand how there is a chain reaction in terms of if something goes wrong really early on, how it's going to impact further development in the brain. And that's why we're trying to take a step-by-step approach to have this conversation. And I'm sure at some point we'll jump back a bit and get into some other things as well that are earlier on in that development again. But today, you and I talking about something that you are actually quite passionate about, which is the role of the cerebellum. And we're going to talk about specifically today, the role of cerebellum in working memory. And a lot of people, and I've even used it in a very broad sense, working memory is a very broad term. And you and I were talking about this before we went live. Can you talk to us about working memory in terms of what all the different aspects of it that we could be looking at here so that parents can see if this is something that really applies to their child?
Yeah, sure. So ultimately, what we're trying to establish in this conversation is the relationship to, hey, we have a symptom or we have a skill that we see in a child or an adult that may not be working to its maximum performance. So what we're trying to relate here is I'm trying to change that conversation and say, hey, let's not be so focused on the symptom. Let's be more focused on what does the symptom tell us in terms of a circuit that may not be maturing as well. And when we get into working memory is actually a very complex network of a variety of different parts of the brain that are working. The general idea of working memory is that at any given moment, we might be doing a certain task. For example, like right now, as you and I are conversating, where our brain is working for the words and we're pre-planning before we even say what's going to come out of our mouth in our brain. So there is a form of working memory that's there. So we could be actually using verbal memory. Okay, we could be using word retrieval because we're trying to retrieve words. And so by definition, working memory is really a process in the brain that occurs in a multitude of different functions that we do. And what it does is it allows us to do it in a certain time frame, okay, in a very short time frame to maybe a couple minutes. And then we get into longer memory processes of short-term memory versus long-term memory. But working memory, at the end of the day, is the definition of it's happening at that moment. Okay, I'm trying to remember what I'm going to say, or I'm going to try to, again, pay attention to what you're saying, and then going to then try to answer it. So working memory is allowing me to do that. Okay, now the question becomes, what forms of working memory? And that, I think, is a very big distinction. So what I want the audience to understand is that we can't just use the term working memory. It's a very kind of catch-all term, as opposed to being specific to what form of working memory. Are we talking about spatial memory? Are we talking about verbal memory? Are we talking about phonological aspects or articulational aspects? Talking about auditory components of working memory, okay? So there's a variety of these different aspects, because at the end of the day, what we want to move away from, and this is, I think, a fault that's happened for so long in developmental delay arena, is that everyone gets so focused on the symptoms or the diagnosis, and probably more the diagnosis, because the symptoms then drive what becomes eventually the diagnosis, as opposed to actually saying what's functionally going on. So for example, we could have an adult or a child with ADHD, and they may have a working memory issue, but what type of working memory? Is it spatial memory? Is it an auditory component? Is it a verbal component? And it's very important, because the one thing that I want to make clear to everyone is that regardless of the developmental disorder, they are what we call this heterogeneity aspect of it, that it's all different. It's not fair to compare one child with autism to another child with autism. And I don't care if you're using the general aspects of mild versus moderate to severe. Okay, been doing this a long time. Same thing with ADHD, and the same thing with learning disabilities, or the same thing with even this in adults. And then I do a lot of work in Parkinson's and neurodegeneration. And I can tell you, there's no one Parkinson's patient that looks alike. Okay, so the circuit matters. So when you're examining a patient, we need to look at, okay, is this child having spatial memory problems as opposed to verbal memory problems? Because from a therapeutic standpoint, it really matters, that rather than just saying, hey, your child's got working memory.
Yeah, well, and so that it does beg that question. So let's talk about specific examples of those different types of, like, so what would a parent see if their child had a spatial memory, working memory deficit versus a verbal? And I think even within the verbal, there's probably multiple kinds. So can you give some examples so that people can sort of recognize, and they go, oh, okay, well, that I see where that's different than the other one. And sometimes I'm guessing that some of these kids have multiple working memory deficits in multiple different facets as well.
So one, let's just talk about spatial relationships. So first of all, where does spatial activity generally happen? It happens more in the right-hand side of the brain. Okay, it has a lot to do more with the right parietal lobe in that relationship. So again, any child that probably right off the bat has any type of body awareness, spatial awareness relationships, okay? And then when they get into more spatial relation tasks, like one of the examples that I would say is very common in children that are probably 15 and older are the ones that are trying to drive, or their parents are even afraid to get them a driver's license because they have their ability to have that spatial orientation, to have these multiple sensory inputs that are coming in simultaneously from a spatial aspect. Okay, again, I'm driving in that car and I got all kinds of spatial input coming in from the right visual field, the left visual field in front of me, and I having to pay to this, and I have to pay attention to the sounds that I'm hearing. I'm on in Atlanta, we got roads that are 8 lanes. So, okay, I can't just pay attention to that one lane. I have to pay attention to all lanes. I have to pay attention to information behind me. And again, I see this in the world of patients that have traumatic brain injuries and concussions. I do a lot of that kind of work in consulting there. And you see a lot of these patients have spatial problems after a concussion. Okay. And they're talking about they fear the fear of getting in a car now and trying to process that information. So again, anything that looks at spatial in relationships to images, Again, how about simply being able to look at a piece of paper, it has a bunch of words on it, and then I have to, kind of clue in and find out where the words are, and I have to lock into this one particular area on the page. That would be an indication of some spatial aspects. Okay. So again, that's very specific into the right-hand side, generally the right parietal lobe. So we may see some other parietal lobe-based issues where we look at things like where if we want to have a child close their eyes or an adult close their eyes, and then we start writing numbers in their hands, and can they perceive that? That might be a sign of if they're inaccurate in being able to perceive the letter that or the number that we might be writing in their hand with their eyes closed. That can be a little bit of a parietal relationship. Again, I think back years ago when we were doing some younger cases, and let's say that old game called Perfection, and the game where you had all the geometric shapes, and then you had a little timer, and you had to try to put the different shapes into the grid. Again, there was a lot of times that, again, children, and I've seen this in adults as well, where they couldn't just take that shape and be able to maneuver it and manipulate it. So, cases of people that have problems with manipulating something in a three-dimensional relationship, that's going to be more of a spatial aspect. Okay. Or again, if you ask somebody for directions and I want you to tell me directions to something, and then be able to, when you're saying directions, okay, turn right at, hey, the CVS over here, and then go up the street and turn left at such and such marker. That's more spatial memory.
Yeah. And I think what's great about these examples, and sometimes people say, well, I can see some of myself in that, or I see some of my children in that. There's obviously, as you were saying before, is that you're looking at the specific deficits, and then obviously there's different severities of that, and you can rehab that to improve the ability to have those skills or the ability of the working memory to in those particular areas.
Yeah, because again, as a functional neurologist and anyone who's doing functional neurology, at the end of the day, we are not getting locked into symptoms. Okay, the symptoms are giving us a potential window into where we may think the deficit may be, and now we have to go in and we have to examine that. So we examine that particular part of the brain. If we suspect that the parietal lobe's involved, then we're going to examine the parietal lobe with other various tests and see if that's the case. And then if that's the case, then we know that we may want to do specific types of therapy into that particular area. So again, at the end of the day, what we want to make sure that the viewers are getting is that let's move away from the symptoms. Let's move away from the diagnosis. Let's let them give us a window into functionality and the function of this specific circuit. Because again, that spatial relationship in the right hemisphere and the right parietal lobe is very hardwired to the left cerebellum. Mm-hmm. But now all of a sudden I go and I look at cerebellum symptoms, and again, taking the left arm and saying, okay, moving the left arm back and forth and turning it upside down. And if I see breakdown in this movement in the left hand, that is a sign of what we call dysdiakinetic movements. If we have them do finger to nose, we can look at dysmetric movements. And again, if I'm doing it in the left hand, I'm actually looking at the integrity of the left cerebellum. Well, I know the left cerebellum is hardwired to that right parietal lobe. It's hardwired to other parts of the right hemisphere, but there's a clear connection. So the great thing about all the science, and I think why you and I get excited when we geek out on this stuff, is that all this stuff is becoming very well established in the literature. We fundamentally know that the cerebellum is a major player in all developmental disorders, psychiatric disorders. And if we're not treating into the cerebellum, then we're probably not going to make long-standing changes in these children or adults.
Yeah. Well, and which actually leads in really well to, you had sent me a paper last week that was relatively recently released. And then you were just mentioning a couple more papers that had come out from some of your favorite, as you said.
Brand new yesterday.
Brand new, coming out from your favorite cerebellum researchers, which only...
My two favorite, all together on the same paper. So that was even more geeky.
It's like geek heaven. So let's talk about that. The first paper you sent me, though, that does start to, like you said, and you've been saying to me for quite a while about how you just see this increasing trend in research that's coming out to cement what you've been seeing clinically for a really long time. So let's geek out a little bit about what the research is telling you and how that ties to what clinically you've been seeing for so long.
So again, the two researchers I'm really geeked about is Jeremy Schmamann and CJ Studley. She actually studied on the Schmamann. Schmamann's at actually Mass General Hospital. He's been probably I would say the authority in the world on the cerebellum. And probably about 25 years ago, he wrote 2025, he wrote a landmark textbook called Cerebellum and Cognition. And it really was a game changer in neuroscience, because up to that point, probably to like, let's say the mid 80s, maybe upper 80s, the majority of thinking at the time in neuroscience and neurology was that the main function of the cerebellum was all tied to our motor system. Mm-hmm. Then all of a sudden we get this era of advanced imaging, neuroimaging, and we can start doing, functional MRI studies. We can start looking at the tracography. We can use a ton of different types of neuroimaging. And that began to change the whole relationship of what we thought that the cerebellum did. And now we know without a shadow of doubt, most of it based on Schmamann's work and others, but he was the one who really set the stage, is that the cerebellum has all these non-motor functions. And about 20 years ago, Schmamann then came out with the idea of this term called cerebellum cognitive affective syndrome. And now a bunch of researchers are utilizing that as a template to say, okay, guess what? We can now see that the different regions of the cerebellum, different parts of the cerebellum have very distinct connections to the cortex and to the brainstem. And again, we knew that there was these connections between the cerebellum and the brainstem anatomically for a long time. But again, most people were always associating it with motor function, okay? Because again, prior to neuroimaging, most of our research on brain was based on if somebody had a brain injury, what functions did they lose? Okay, if they had a stroke, what functions did they lose? We could do some post-mortem studies and stuff like that and look at the actual anatomy of the brain, but we didn't get a chance to see functional. Mm-hmm. Now in neuroscience and neuroimaging studies, we can do two things and this is really cool, is that one, with certain types of neuroimaging techniques, we can look at the brain in a resting state. It's called RSFC, so resting state functional connectivity. So meaning that we can watch the brain actively as it's just sitting there, okay? Then we can have where now we do task specific. And within the environment of the lab, we can do a task, and whether it's a motor task or a cognitive task, and then watch what parts of the brain begin to work. And so what they do in a lot of this research is they do what we call ROI, regions of interest. So they go in and they start studying these specific regions, and they begin to see what areas of the brain are lighting up. And again, this is not QEEG, this is actually functional MRIs and diffuser tensor imaging and stuff like that at research levels. And Schmamann and Studley are some of the people that are really doing this at a high level. And again, what we've been able to show is that there are very specific contributions from different parts of the cerebellum that are firing in concert or activating the upper parts of the brain to perform, say, spatial memory or to perform verbal memory. So at the end of the day is that there's no form of cognition or socialization or emotional regulation that can't happen without the presence of a functioning cerebellum. For me, who's someone who's been doing this for a long time and working with adults and children, is that if we're not addressing the cerebellum, then we have a big problem, okay? Because you can go up there and you can try to do cognitive-based therapy or tutoring or something like that. But if you're not down in that cerebellum and you're not integrating the cerebellum in relationship to the brainstem and the vestibular system, I think you're going to be walking a very slow road to recovery for most of these children.
Yeah.
And that's not even taking into account the cerebellum's contribution to, or cerebellum's, how neuroinflammation and gut inflammation impact the cerebellum. So that's a whole nother topic. So
yeah, we'll have to do that maybe the next time. When I listen to you talk about this, and so from a firsthand experience, and you know this because I had the pleasure of working with you with my children, in particular with my eldest, that wasn't until we did this, and I've said this to you many, many times, it wasn't until we did the work with you, and in particular, you were doing a lot of rehab on, in terms of with respect to the cerebellum. And it wasn't until we did that we saw this major growth, which I personally wasn't expecting at the time, and both cognition and emotional regulation. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden it was like, boom. And the tutors that my daughter was working with at the time were wondering what was going on. What's different, what's going on. We saw around, just in terms of her day-to-day, she was old enough at this point to also recognize the fact that she was better able to self-regulate in terms of get things that would normally upset her. Even if they did upset her, she could calm herself down much faster than she had been in the past. So from a practical standpoint for our parents, what I can tell you is that if you do this work and do the rehab that Dr. Scire is talking about, you start to see these changes pretty quickly in your children. And it is makes a massive difference in all the other things that you're working on.
And again, when we started working together years ago, this literature was coming out, and this is probably around maybe 3-4 years ago when I presented at IAFNR, and I did a talk on dyslexia. And at that moment, the literature was a little bit there, but now, fast forward 3 years, the literature is so much more clearer in terms of these networks. And what's been fun, and what is, I think, exciting, and anytime, a lot of my colleagues in the functional neurology world, we're never standing still. We're always reading literature, and then we're trying to find the applications, because at the end of the day, if I know the circuit, then I'll figure out what particular rehab strategy I have to use to impact that circuit. And so what we're doing now in the clinic is far greater than what I was doing even 3-4 years ago, in terms of how we're challenging that cerebellum. What specific parts of the cerebellum are we challenging at that moment when we're giving a cerebellum therapy? And then how are we looping it back into the upper parts of the brain? If I want to use a cerebellum to frontal lobe treatment, how am I doing that? If I want to do a cerebellum to the parietal lobe, how am I doing that? If I want to go cerebellum to the temporal lobe, how are we doing that? And again, the most important thing for our listeners to understand is that you cannot fall folly to the idea that my child has autism or my child has ADHD. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how, or that adult that has a brain injury, same thing, is that how is that presenting neurologically in you, okay? And what circuits are maybe underdeveloped from childhood developmental aspect or been affected by injury, and then how are we going to go in and rehab? And that's the most important thing, because again, we can have a child with ADHD or an adult with ADHD that has a verbal problem and a verbal memory issue. So that in itself is going to change how we may treat into that system, okay? Because again, verbal memory problems are going to be more right cerebellum based. So I would expect to probably see more right cerebellum issues than left cerebellum issues. So that's a very big distinction. And again, in going back to the primitive reflexes, we could actually see some primitive reflexes that might be on more one side of the body than the other side of the body. So what is that telling us? And so again, these are things that are really important to move away from. I know the step of the process is getting a child diagnosed, but after that process, we now have to get into and say, what is the footprint of your child's functional connectivity? What parts of the brain are overconnected and what parts of the brain are underconnected? Because we know that to be true. We know that, for example, with some of the autism genes that are out there right now, those autism genes that they're finding out are actually ones that are actually coding for the cerebellum. So, and the cerebellum is one of the early parts of the brain to develop. It's developing very quickly early on in development. And so there's a lot of potential steps that could be altered genetically, epigenetically, that could change the integrity of how these different parts of the cerebellum are going to work.
Yeah. So what, like, I mean, obviously we know, I think most of the people in this audience know, that we don't want to focus on diagnosis, although we all get caught up in it from time to time. And then we tell them to look at the symptoms. And you're taking it one step farther and saying, don't necessarily, symptoms can guide you, but you can't rely on symptoms. You've got to get down to figuring out exactly which is of course what we all want, is what's the root cause of those symptoms in the first place, and getting through to that. There's two things I think that people aren't familiar with, because most people haven't experienced a functional neurological examination, and then what types of rehab, and we talked a little bit about this the last time, and we'll probably continue to talk about it so that people can understand what you're talking about, in terms of what they go through when they step into a functional neurologist's office and get that assessment.
I lost you somehow. Can you still see me?
Oh, I can still see you.
Okay. You
can't see me, but I can hear you and see you. Well, I think we're okay for the moment.
All right. Just something popped up on my screen.
That's okay.
Again, well, I mean, obviously we're talking about the cerebellum. So one of the first things that we want to look at in terms of cerebellum is muscle tone. Okay. A child that has, tendency to have low muscle tone, and maybe more specifically muscle tone that is tied to their upper body extremities, tied to their shoulders, tied to some posterior muscles of their body, spinal muscles, their pelvic girdle. In terms of that, we're going to look at, those are going to be more classical cerebellum signs. Again, in coordination, okay, having in coordination in terms of their motor planning, their motor coordination. Again, things that, an OT or PT may pick up, but the relationship of the fact that these are motor in the cerebellum findings. Obviously, the fluidity of language, the smoothness of how we actually talk, okay, that is very cerebellum based. I kind of use a root analogy, but I think it's a good analogy that most people actually get. For those who like their occasional beer or their occasional wine, have a little bit too much tonight, and then you'll have a bunch of cerebellum signs. Right?
That's a good way for a parent to figure it out.
Don't get over in the car. If you're that parent that needs that good Pinot Noir, pick up a couple glasses, and then we'll start testing your cerebellum. Okay, but then you're going to have a slurring of speech. You're going to have an incoordination of your speech. You're going to have problems with eye tracking. You're not going to be able to smoothly track your eyes as well. You're going to make a lot more errors. So one of the things the cerebellum is doing is initiating a movement, it's terminating movement, and then it's making sure the movement is smooth in between that initiation and termination. And so again, something as simply as this, I want to make sure it's smooth. Okay. And so again, that's a very important aspect. Okay. Looking at balance, looking at gait relationships, those are all controlled through the cerebellum. So those are things from a bedside functional neurological exam that we begin to look at and say, okay, hey, do I start having cerebellum signs? Now the question starts in which cerebellum might be the one that's more underdeveloped, and then what parts of the cerebellum. There are three major parts of the cerebellum. There's an anterior part, there's a posterior, and then what we call a vermal area. And again, they give off different symptoms. Okay, the anterior portion of the cerebellum is probably going to give us all more sensory motor problems. The posterior part of the cerebellum is going to probably give us more cognitive issues. And then we get into our vermal centers, we're probably going to get into more balance and issues and vestibular-based aspects. And so these are things that are, again, in the big picture are very important to look at and assess for, because again, we want to obviously localize and be able to get as local as we can into that specific circuit, and then target our brain-based therapy towards it.
Yeah, and all that is really helpful. And actually, we had a question just come in from Heather. She's just asking, how does someone who can provide, how do I find someone who can provide this rehab and help provide the footprint of the cerebellum. And guess what? She's in Atlanta. So Heather, I'm telling you, you're lucky that because Dr. Scire is actually in Atlanta. So I would recommend you go see him. For those of you that are listening, we'll post some links in the comments after that we're done today of the member directory for the IAFNR and for the Carrick Institute, a couple of the different organizations that train functional neurologists, so that you can find one in your local area as well. But also Dr. Scire, and we can talk about that some more too, works remotely with patients as well if you're interested in working directly with him. So so that gave us a great, thank you for that, because that gave us a really good picture of what types of things you're looking for and how that all maps out. When it comes to, I mean, I think I can, we can probably extrapolate from that what you just described in terms of the types of things you do to rehab them. But let's talk a little bit about what do rehabilitation exercises look like, and why is it something that parents can actually do from their home remotely with someone like you?
Well, I mean, again, I think the degree of it is the relationship of how underdeveloped is the cerebellum. Again, we started at some basics where it could be just simply having an adult or a child stand one foot in front of the other or if they can't, what we call a tandem stance. If they can't do a tandem stance, a lot of times with cerebellum problems, you'll have more of a wide-based stance. So we may start out by trying to see if we can get someone to stand with their feet close together, or then stand one foot in front of the other, and then progress to where they're standing on one leg. And then after that, they can progress to standing on a balance foam or something like that. And then if we want to get more advanced, we can do it with their eyes closed and rely more now on their vestibular apparatus and their proprioception, as opposed to having their visual system cue them into stability aspects. So, I mean, that's something as simple. Vibration is a very powerful modality that we can use to stimulate different networks in the cerebellum. So we can have someone holding a vibration device and then actually doing what we call complex movements. Complex movements are very related to the cerebellum. The cerebellum and the frontal lobe have to activate to do this, and we may have someone do some type of figure 8 movement while they have a vibration device in their hand or something like that. Electrical stimulation through TENS units can actually get the brain, get the muscles to contract and fire and stimulate. So, we may have someone be doing a postural exercise where they might be lifting their hips off the ground and trying to hold it for an extended period of time. At the same time, they have a TENS unit on their back that's firing their muscles and stuff like that. So the one thing about the cerebellum is that it gets a tremendous amount of its activation from your muscles. Mm-hmm. So we can use some sensory stimulation into our muscles through, again, vibration or electrical stimulation as well, or we can actively contract the muscle to fire the cerebellum. And again, there are different muscles that are a little bit more specific into the cerebellum. As you get closer to the spine, you get a little bit more specific to certain types of muscles that fire into the cerebellum. Some of your posterior muscles fire, or most of your posterior muscles fire more powerfully into your cerebellum. Your spinal muscles are actually fire very powerfully into your cerebellum. It's called the spinocerebellum loops and stuff. So again, and then you have your vestibular apparatus. So your inner ear doing particular vestibular movements can again fire into the cerebellum as well. So these are a variety of different applications or networks that allow us to get into specific parts of the brain and work. The question, that really comes is that what parts of the cerebellum in that particular patient or that are different in terms of how we may treat one person versus another.
Yeah. Because we're getting some questions, and now I'm going to get another question here. John Mekrit. Hi, John. It's great to see you. He's a neurofeedback practitioner. I know John was another speaker, like you were on a number of the summits in the past years. He's a neurofeedback practitioner, and I'm very supportive of using conductivity measures to guide our training. I use QEEG-based diagnostic tool from David Kaiser, and to evaluate functional conductivity and train accordingly. I would love to know more about how to use your diagnostic tools to enhance our work. So how can neurofeedback practitioners integrate some of what you do into what they do?
I think obviously, they can start, taking the courses that Dr. Malil has been teaching for years through IAFNR and functional neurology. I know he's doing an advanced course. We're doing an advanced course in Chicago. I'll be joining him in Chicago in June. And then I know that we're looking at some other sites. Wait a second, my battery's going a little low, so I know.
we better get you plugged in.
But I know that we're looking at another site potentially for the courses to be set. But right now, I know that the streaming ones that we did in Chicago in 2016 and 2017 are available through the IAFNR website, and you can purchase them and watch them at your own rate. But to do live classes with us, you probably want to go through Dr. Malil's website and be able to find it that way. But that would be the first starting point, to be able to sit there and begin to gain the diagnostic assessment tools that we do, and then get some clinical tools.
Yes, and I'm sorry, there's a fire truck going behind me. You can tell you're live when everything's going at the same time. I would also say, for anybody that's interested in learning more about functional neurology, to attend the IAFNR conference, which is every fall as well. And we'll be posting a link to IAFNR, because it's a great place. They encourage an integrative approach. So John, I know you'd be welcomed there, as I was last fall when I attended. So there were some papers that came out, even like you said today. Have you had a chance to take a look at them? Is there anything you wanted to share from those with us today?
Well, again, I think what we'll do is we'll try to post a little bit about those papers and even some pictures of the papers, so people can see, some of the anatomical networks that we're talking about. But again, I think, what we want to really explore is the various networks. And again, we can get into a little bit more of the cerebellum's role in attention, the cerebellum's role in emotion. We can literally take a topic and say, okay, what's the contribution of the cerebellum? And again, I think the biggest thing that we as practitioners and people that are wanting to educate families about this is that I'm very much interested in the neurobiology of these developmental disorders and brain-based disorders as a whole, because again, even when I'm working with adults, I'm reverting back to their childhood development and looking at how is that impacting them, and then obviously taking it one step further and layering it into the relationship of what is the metabolic aspects, what are the relationships of neuroimmunology, endocrinology. Again, someone who has food sensitivities and an immunological response, they're gonna alter their cerebellum in a greater degree to someone who doesn't, and stuff like that. To the cerebellum to something like polyvagal theory and stuff like that. So there's all these different aspects, and so I think for us, or at least for me, the biggest thing that I'm trying to get everyone to understand is that we do have to start fundamentally with these lower brain structures. They set the stage for higher brain to neurologically develop in a child into adolescence and further into adulthood. And then even when you get into adulthood and you potentially are having some type of neuropsychiatric aspect or retained ADHD. I mean, I get a lot of calls on adults that, hey, I had, ADHD as a child and it's not getting any better. What can I do about it? Again, the answer is not just simply, hey, put them on a pharmaceutical aspect. It's like, hey, let me go in and let me check that cerebellum. And I'm amazed to see that, when I examine patients at 28 and 30 and so on, that guess what? They still have primitive reflexes. Yeah. Their anxiety tied to that.
Yeah. And which is, I find fascinating. And I think it's one of the things we talked about the last time too, is that sometimes also a concussion can cause, or so we have to look at these things going throughout our lives as well as throughout our children's lives, because unfortunately, our kids tend to hit their heads a lot over as they're growing up, and it can just add to the challenges that they're already dealing with. But one of the things you mentioned just now, though, too, is that you don't ignore obviously the whole aspect around in terms of at a cellular level, and also at a from a biological level, what people are dealing with in terms of nutrient deficiencies and gut health and overall inflammation, if they're dealing with that, and how that plays a role as well. So can you just touch base on how you integrate the two when you're working with someone?
Yeah, and I think again that was a big breakthrough in functional neurology over the last, say, 7 or 8 years. A lot of the work that was brought to us by the T. Skarazian and Brandon Brock and others that really, came before us to sit there and go, how do we now, because for a long time we were running on a parallel, we were just running on one track, and it was functional neurology. And then several of our practitioners said, okay, how do we now look at neuroinflammatory aspects, look at gut relationships and how that plays a role. And so again, it really depends on the case and what I'm dealing with in terms of what type of test that I may run in terms of a functional. I might look at micronutrients. I might run a stool test to look at the gut microbiome and look at pathogens and opportunistic bacteria and look at the immunological aspects of the immune system. Again, I might run a genomic test. Again, it really just depends on the individual case. I try not to just take, hey, this is my standard 5 test I'm running. Here's $2,000 worth of tests, and pay me. I try to look at it from an individual standpoint and say, hey, right now, based on symptom presentation, based on functional presentation, what test might give me the best information at that moment, and then try to develop an individualized protocol to address what I might be looking at metabolically. And then from there, if I need to then move on to another test or something like that, I'm a little bit more pragmatic about it in that regard, because again, I'm a little bit sensitive to how much people are paying for a variety of things, because you get in some of these advanced labs and they're really awesome, they're cutting edge, but they get very costly. And so you just have to, I think, be a little bit more prudent about which ones you choose to use. But there's a variety of things that we may want to utilize. We may do some organic acid testing. We may do some oats testing. So again, we may run a traditional functional blood chemistry test to look at, is there an underlying anemia? Okay, is there an active infection or a chronic infection? And then if that comes back up on a white blood cell differential, am I now going to move to a more advanced blood test to look at viral markers, and what particular viral markers am I maybe potentially suspecting based on the presentation or the history of the patient. So it really just depends on and the same thing goes from a functional neurology assessment, is that we do this functional neurology, very extensive functional neurology exam that I do in the office, and then from there we're going to then treat accordingly. We're gonna map out an individualized model of rehabilitation based on what the clinical findings are. So,
yeah, which is, I think that's why this is so successful, is because it is so personalized. We had a few questions that came in advance of the call today too. So I just wanted to make sure that they get covered off before we go, if you have a few more minutes for me. First, Steve asked, do you have any ideas on how to stop, it's a pretty broad question, obsessive thinking? So obviously he has a child with that has obsessive thoughts.
Okay. It's a great question, because again, one of the things that we're seeing now more in the literature is, again, this idea of obsessions or compulsions or OCD, as we would term it, which again in itself is a very broad statement. Okay, because let's just back up a moment and say, so obsessions are going to be more involved with your cognitive pathways. Okay, I'm thinking about something. I'm constantly thinking about this particular thing. So it's more of a thought, where a compulsion is more of an emotor event. Okay, so let's say I'm excessively washing my hands, or I have this motoric ritualistic thing that I got to do. In some cases, you see both. Mm-hmm. Some is you see one. So right off the bat, just by assessing it that way, you can begin to start looking at it from a differential standpoint and what network that's involved. Now, there are certain things that when we look at these parts of the brain that are involved, we have this thing called our basal ganglia. And our basal ganglia is an area of brain that basically allows for information to excite our brain. And then there's a governance in this system to where we're not overly constantly exciting at such a high rapid rate all the time. And again, this is happening at nanosecond speed, if not faster, that we're exciting our part. Now, one of the things that happens is our frontal lobe comes down and modulates how much of that activation is coming up into the brain through our thalamus and our basal ganglia loops. One of the things that we know in the literature in ADHD or autism or other development disorders and even into anxiety disorders, and in relation to that, is that we have this problem in the frontal striatal networks. They call this, the striatum is a certain part of the basal ganglia pathway, but it's called frontal striatal system. So basically we've lost some inhibition down from our frontal lobe. So the question is, why is our frontal lobe not functioning? Well, again, if we have primitive reflexes that are retained, there's a window into our frontal lobe. If we're having problems in different types of cognitive aspects, okay, I think one of our talks is going to have to be the anatomy of the frontal lobe, because we can't just simply say it's the frontal lobe. There are very specific regions of the frontal lobe, whether we're talking about the lateral aspect of the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, the ventral medial part of the frontal cortex. They have very distinct presentations. So how's this tied into what we're talking about right now is that the cerebellum has a whole lot to do with the modulation of that output of that basal ganglia, as well as the output into the frontal lobe aspect. And we also believe that there are certain cells that are in the cerebellum that we're finding out may not have been fully formed in the cerebellum, and that can lead to why we see repetitive behaviors in a child or ritualistic aspects and stuff like that. So the long answer is that we have to look at these networks. There's not a little magic wand trick that I can give you and say, hey, put this in your hand and that'll fix it. But we have to look at that cerebellum, look at that frontal lobe, and try to build down inhibition, because many things that the frontal lobe does is it inhibits a lot of those deeper structures and those deeper networks in the brain, the limbic system, the basal ganglia aspects. And when we can get an imbalance in those systems, and hence why we can get an exacerbation in symptomatology.
Yeah. So I think that Steve, hopefully that answers your question. Obviously, it's not a simple answer, but I mean, even if you are just to look at the primitive reflex piece alone to start with, and then get in to see someone who could do a full assessment, you'd probably get a good head start on things.
Yeah, because that's probably the quickest thing that the easiest thing that a parent could do, or even in a brain injury and stuff like that. We were talking about a couple of weeks ago how I was attending a Parkinson's patient and they had retained primitive reflexes. So the question is number one, did they have them always? Did they have them? Or B, as their brain began to degenerate, that the frontal lobe no longer could inhibit those parts of the brainstem, and now these aspects. Now, my hope is as we try to restore some integrity to that frontal lobe, that maybe do we get some inhibition of those systems, because those presence of those primitive reflexes are actually changing her motoricity, changing the way she's walking, changing the way she's sitting, and stuff like that. So that's something. But as far as being able to really just begin to a basic level to look at frontal lobe integrity would be, are there primitive reflexes there? Because if they're there, then we know that the frontal lobe is immature neurologically, and we can take it one step further and say, are we seeing immaturity in cognition? Are we seeing immaturity in social function, not able to emotionally modulate? Then we know we have a gamut of frontal lobe immaturity, and now we just have to isolate into which regions of the frontal lobe are underactive, and that requires a little bit more exam.
Yeah. The next question that came in was from I think Alicia, and she said, my son is a second grader, and he's a young second grader. He's a July birthday. He's doing well academically in school in sixth grade with sixth grade reading comprehension. And even though he's in second grade, obviously, and good at math, science, and writing. He's always struggled with emotional regulation at home. It's hard to get him motivated and keep him on task. Any ideas for home and school with this? He's starting to become a distraction at school.
Well, again, they're perfect questions to kind of lead into the other. The aspect of, again, the frontal lobe coming down and inhibiting these limbic systems, that's what I was talking about, this emotional regulation, again, can be driven through the cerebellum. So anytime you're doing any type of cerebellum-based activity, so one of the easiest things to do from a cerebellum standpoint is actually get your child to start doing some complex motor tasks, whether it's cross-crawl movements, whether it's maybe trying to have them walk in a straight line, having them to do something that activates their cerebellum, which also has to activate their frontal lobe to be able to do these complex motor tasks. You're then going to create inhibition through the other loops into the limbic system or into that obsession compulsive. When you're trying to deal purely cognitively with the child, you're bypassing the cerebellum. Okay, or same thing with doing some vestibular type of activity. Okay, so maybe putting your child in a chair and spinning them, or doing some type of activity where they're trying to move their body in space and change their orientation. They're going to need their proprioceptive system and their vestibular system. And again, they activate their cerebellum. They activate their spinal cerebellum by doing some type of balance activity or some type of postural activity and stuff like that. And the literature is very clear on the fact that all these children have postural instability problems and they have issues with motor coordination and stuff like that. I've had families that come in to me over the years, or even adults, like, I have great motor timing and stuff like that. And you put them on something like a computerized metronome and their motor timing is completely non-existent. So again, these are things that contribute, but on a simple level, I would just begin to challenge some motor tasks. The cool thing right now is that there's all these different little devices, and you and I have been talking about them, is that, for example, I would say like trying to find like an indoor type of balance apparatus that you can begin to put your child on and try to have them do some balancing type of activity, because that in itself requires such a degree of specialization from the cerebellum. And you do it, 10, 15, 20 minutes. And then you may have them then sit down and do some type of cognitive task or homework or something like that. And then, if they're getting a little bit more emotionally tired or their brain's fatiguing a little bit, then get them back up, challenge that motor system. So the best way to get that frontal lobe to kick in and inhibit is try using those cerebellum loops.
Yeah. We actually, in response to that, Heather asks or says that they do a lot of wheelbarrows before beginning schoolwork, which is great to activate the brain. Is this something they need to do forever, or once the reflexes are fixed, or are they able to modulate their focus on their own at some point in time?
Well, again, as you know, what's going to happen is the frontal lobe begins to mature more. We should see see further inhibition. Okay, again, the frontal lobe, it doesn't fully mature until we get into our later adolescence, and now we're pushing it up to almost 25 years of maturation. But to try to get that frontal lobe to kick in enough now to where it's doing its acceptable job to what is emotional regulation for that of a second grader and stuff like that. But again, in his case, not knowing the history, there may need to be more activation than just doing, a simple wheelbarrow type of activity and stuff like that. But again, if it continues and you're doing that vestibular stimulation, then we just may have to find more specific pathways that might be underactive in that particular case, and then stimulate them accordingly and stuff like that. There's all types of eye movements that we can do to stimulate different parts of the cerebellum. We can do different types of challenging motor tasks that might activate a certain system. In the cerebellum, there's three major loops that allow us to do specific motor activity, and we can target that specific motor activity. Like for example, like throwing a ball against a wall, that activates a certain network in the cerebellum and stuff like that. So these are things that, again, maybe having him, take a little basketball or something like that and try to begin to dribble that, okay, and stuff like that. That might be something that, again, if you think about trying to dribble, I have to create this motor action, then I also have to concentrate. I got to focus. So I'm reinforcing that cerebellum frontal lobe. The worst thing we can do is just allow them to sit and sit on some type of a video game or a smartphone and think that we're going to improve the frontal lobe, because you're not. You're going to activate the dopamine system a whole lot, and you're going to probably bring on rage at that point. So the worst thing we would want to do is put them in front of a screen.
Yeah.
Get them moving, give them a motor task that might be fun for them to do. Teach them how to maybe try to hula hoop, try to, teach them how to, jump rope, something like that requires a very finite activity of the cerebellum.
Yeah. And what I'd say to Heather is that there's all these exercises, but part of the reason, she's the one that's actually in the Atlanta area. Part of the reason why you want to get someone to look at your child and there specifically, when you get the specific exercises to rehab the parts of the brain that your specific child needs, it makes all the difference in the world. So we a lot of us, including myself, we share a lot of resources that are more broad-based to get people some ideas, like doing wheelbarrows and different types of sensory activities and things that definitely help these kids. But when you get down to the point where you can specialize, come up with the specific exercises that are needed for your child, you're going to see a big difference a lot faster. And you're going to make sure that you're targeting the right areas for your child and not actually potentially working against yourself, because that does happen from time to time too. Is that not?
Yeah, I mean, because again, I mean, we can talk about some generalizational aspects in terms of some things that, like, again, anytime you're doing a complex motor task, you are going to, let's say we're trying to teach a child how to play hopscotch or something like that. Okay, that's a great, and I think that part of what we're seeing probably more than ever in just the overall development of a child in this current age is we're doing less and less of that. We're less challenging the cerebellum. Okay, they're not riding their bikes the way they probably, amount of hours that we probably rode as kids, or, they're not skateboarding or something like that, or they're not many kids. I mean, there's less and less kids that are physically active more than ever. And so these I think are some fundamental things that are also contributing to why we're not seeing the changes neurologically that we have. Because again, after years of working with families, I was always amazed by how inactive a child may be, and that may have never led to any type of childhood obesity, or in some cases it did, but the generality was that they were so much more consumed by these screens. So I really challenge our listeners out there to actually assess how much time that their child actually sits physically in front of a screen. And whether it's, and again, it used to be, and the joke was, when we were probably growing up, is how much TV we're working on. Now it's not, most kids are probably not watching a TV. If anything, they're watching all these videos and all these things off screen, stuff like that. So again, my big thing, first and foremost, on a general level, is get your child more motorically active, okay? And whether that's playing hopscotch with them, or jump roping with them, or hula hooping with them, or again, trying to see if you can, get them to ride a bike, or, even go to a park and then climb a rock wall, or, monkey bars, or anything like that. That in itself, and letting them fail, letting their nervous system fail, because as their nervous system begins to actually move in these little parts, you're actually creating neuroplasticity. Then all of a sudden, the child that barely could climb across the monkey bars now can do it forward and backwards and all this stuff. And you've created this great aspect that it will have a cognitive gain, because at the end of the day, what we do know, again, is this idea that motor function drives cognition. And when we see all these different motor signs in children and adults, we know inherently we're going to have cognitive problems. We're going to have affect aspects. So now we're getting into personality. And then we get into the whole aspect of emotional dysregulation. So that's why when you look at the literature right now, and I'm combing the literature and I'm looking at all these different types of disorders, whether it's Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, schizophrenia, bipolar, I've yet to come across any of these disorders that doesn't have papers that contribute to the cerebellum.
That's amazing. Olive is just asking, and I think we'll wrap up with this question. She says she often sees kids that won't do as any sport of any kind. Are the primitive reflexes, I think she's referring to, causing this? Is that one of the reasons why they're unwilling to do the sports in the first place?
I don't know necessarily if it's all just the primitive reflexes. Again, they could have spatial aspects. They can have, again, proprioceptive deficits. They could have motor planning. I think more than anything, it's probably a little bit more higher up in the sense to where those primitive reflexes have held back the brain developmentally. And so now we don't see the sophistication within the brain, especially when it comes to motor timing, motor planning, motor coordination. So yeah, you obviously want to address those primitive reflexes, but I would think more so than anything, it's this more finite, this more refined relationship. Because again, as the nervous system develops, it refines itself. It allows itself to do more complex tasks. Mm-hmm. That's, what I'm doing right now, what I'm seeing with a lot of the therapy that I'm doing in my office is that the more complex I make the therapy for the patient, the stronger their levels of cognition gets. And I have some young adults that I'm working with from the last 2 years from your previous summits that have reached out to me and their parents. And the more we change the parameters of their young adults' cerebellum activity, the more we're seeing. And I have some really phenomenal video of some young adults that could not do this particular task from the start. And then after we start doing it, literally they're doing these tasks. And now what we're actually seeing is as when we introduce a new task to them, their response time, their neuroplasticity time is actually shortening. So it's taking them less time for them to make these error corrections within their network, which is really great, because I do think that in these particular cases, where it's going to lead to greater and greater advancements in their cognitive processes. So
yeah, and that's like actually a perfect way to end today, because that's like obviously a message of really great hope. These are patients that you're working with that have been there and tried that, and also are in the young adult range. So they're at that point where a lot of people are giving up on them because they think that there's nothing that could be done at that stage, and that's just not the case from what you're seeing.
And what's even more, I think is more important too, is the fact that I'm working with a lot of adults that are also 60 and older. Mm-hmm. And I've seen some pretty wicked cerebellum problems in this population. And we're going in there therapeutically and we're treating them and their cerebellum's responding. Okay, so the reality of it is that, and I've had some cases where they're actually have had cerebellum pathology that was early on in their 20s. Wasn't necessarily because of a developmental delay. It was more of that this particular part of the cerebellum didn't form. And so we started activating, we activated, and now all of a sudden we're seeing, like, for example, some different types of tremors being able to slow down and stuff like that. So I think that the bigger picture, the broader picture in the 30,000 feet picture is the fact that neuroplasticity is happening. I think that the functional neurology community is able to really do a tremendous service to this population of children as well as adults, into being able to get in there and finite these particular loops. When people reach out to me, regardless of a disorder, like, I really kind of put my ears, cover my ears, because I don't want to know what the disorder is. I just want to get in there and examine the nervous system, examine the different parts of the brain. My exam forms are designed that way, to where I know very specifically these exams that are going to do for this part of the brain. And then at the end, when I'm done, I add everything up and go, okay, I see that cerebellum's not talking to this part of the brain, or cerebellum's not talking to this, or there's problems in the brainstem, or there's problems in the upper part of the brain. And then we're going to just define a treatment protocol that's unique to that particular functional connectivity your connectome is unique to you. It's like your fingerprint. So that connectivity, that connectome aspect, the functional connectivity that's existing between your hemispheres, your brainstem, and your cerebellums is a unique expression of you. It's based on your genetics. It's based on your epigenetics. It's based on a lot of things going on in your gut microbiome and stuff like that. So we have to account for it all. And if we do, then I think we're going to be able to change the functionality of that human being.
Hmm. So, well, and on that note, I think we'll wrap up for today. But there are a couple more questions that are popping, and I'll go in there where I can and answer them, or I'll tag you in them so you can respond to them. But I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to us all today about these things, because they're so important. And sadly, fortunately, the functional neurology community is growing, but there aren't a lot of them out there. So make sure you check out the links below here. You'll be able to find out where you can find Dr. Peter Scire, as well as his colleagues that do work in this area.
Yeah, we have a great slew of practitioners. A lot of them, my dearest friends, and we love going to IAFNA. We love to go to different conferences and geek out, and we just send and text each other back and sharing papers and stuff like that. And again, we're trying to evolve the clinical model and trying to work different technology, advanced technology that's coming out there, other applications that allow us to just do our job better than ever, and being as long as we have a good diagnostic template, and I think we do, and now we can really individualize those treatment plans to the particular patient. So
yeah, no, it's exciting times for sure. Thanks again for joining us here, and we'll be scheduling another one of these very soon.
Yeah, I think we'll talk a little bit more about the cerebellum next time.
Exactly. Perfect. Thanks again.
You're welcome so much.